Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I'm your host, Tara Stubbs, and this episode I'm delighted to say that my guest is Erica McAlpine. Welcome, Erica.
Hi, thank you.
Well, I'm glad that you're here. Erica McAlpine is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of St Edmund Hall, also known as Teddy Hall. Her poetry has appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, Slate, the New Statesman, the Spectator, the Yale Review, Stand, Ambit and the American Scholar, and her poems are featured on Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, and have been broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and BBC World Radio. Her first poetry collection, The Country Gambler, was published by Shearsman Books in 2016. It contained original poems as well as translations from Horace's odes. Her academic book, The Poet's Mistake, about mistakes in poems, appeared with Princeton University Press in 2020. Her second poetry collection, Small Pointed Things, has just been published this year, 2025. McAlpine was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and graduated from Harvard University before earning an MPhil from the University of Cambridge and then a PhD from Yale. Before her appointment at Oxford, she taught at several other universities, including Villanova, Temple, the University of Pennsylvania, and Exeter, and she now lives in Oxford with her husband, son, and daughter, and her birds, I believe.
That's right, 2 parrots and also a tortoise now.
Oh my gosh, I really want a tortoise.
Oh well, we can talk about it. They're actually a little bit more high maintenance than I thought.
We can give them a podcast at some point.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or tortoise poetry, which I think is very slow.
You've made that joke before, haven't you?
I haven't. It's the first time. It just came out.
So, in addition to writing and teaching, Erica also runs a popular reading series called Meet the Poet, which brings internationally celebrated poets to Oxford every year. So I invited you here today because you have so many different types of experiences within the poetry world. You've got your academic interest in poetry, which you wrote up as The Poet's Mistake. You've got your poetry collections, and you also teach and write poetry at the same time. And when I was at your book launch last week, you also mentioned about the juggle that happens between being creative and being critical and how you kind of manage that. So you must have lots of things to say about poetry and the poetry world and accessibility.
I guess so. I hope so. One part of my job is to give lectures, obviously, and I was assigned the task of giving a lecture called Reading Poetry. That was the sort of remit of the lecture, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, how do you do it? How do you read poetry? But it did give me the opportunity really to think about, how you go about doing something like that, as opposed to, for instance, writing it. So,
and this week we've had lots of conversations about what reading means as well.
That's right.
Yeah, because for some it means performing, right?
Yeah. But even for students, reading might not necessarily mean understanding it.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe it just means glancing at words on a page or feeling it in some way.
Yeah.
And actually, when I give that lecture, it's usually a lecture for first years. I try and make it clear that it would be fine to read poems and not get them, as it were. That becomes kind of part of the point of that lecture. Because I think there are a lot of people who think that they are afraid of reading poetry.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about a lot in this podcast.
I like this particular lecture because it's compulsory, so all of the first years come, which means then you're capturing some students who actually really have no interest in learning how to read poetry, and then you can win them over in some way. There's always the opportunity to bring one into the fold, as it were.
And never give them back. Yeah. So how did you become interested in poetry in general and in the types of poetry you write and think about? And do you think those interests have changed over the years?
So I don't remember becoming interested in it. I always remember being interested in it. My first poetry memories are from when I was maybe 7 or 8.
Wow.
But I wasn't reading it, I was writing it. I don't know what the first poems I read were. I'm sure I read a poem before I wrote one, or I certainly hope I did. But I remember as a really young child, like sitting under the bed thinking I was doing something private and secret and writing these very rhymey poems, very sing-songy. And I've basically never looked back. My poems are still really rhymey and sing-songy.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, but I don't know. I have always thought of poems in fairly conventional ways in terms of how I write them. My tastes for poetry, I hope, are much broader than that. But in terms of my own poems, I like them to look like what I think a poem conventionally looks like. I like for them to sound like they are poems. One of the poets I do remember reading as a kind of teenager was Robert Frost, the American poet. And I've never really gotten over him.
It says on the blurb for your book that your poems contain elements of Frost, doesn't it?
Well, that is a huge compliment.
Marianne Moore.
Yeah. Marianne Moore I didn't come to so early, and she doesn't rhyme quite as prevalently as Frost does, although she is a good rhymer. Yeah, I guess I've always had fairly traditional tastes, and I tend to like poets who are sort of classically inspired. Some of the first poets I learned to love were Latin poets, actually. Because early on, when I was in college, I took a lot of Latin courses, and I read Horace and Catullus, and so those very formal, very metrical poems sort of taught me what a poem is.
And some of those translations appeared in The Country Gambit, right?
Yeah, so that book was sort of loosely themed as a sort of conversation between me and Horace, or an apprenticeship of me to Horace in some way. And I tried to move away from that in this book a little bit, although there are some translations in the new book too.
And what do you think of translations as, in terms of, the creation of them, the kind of production of them?
They're really useful for the times when you want to write a poem but you don't necessarily have a subject, I find. So if I'm feeling in the poety mood, if I need to write something, if the muse has descended but I don't have the words, then doing a translation sort of allows the poetry to come about without having the full resources of your own imagination. The other thing translation does is it allows you to steal what is good in someone else's writing, sort of put it on like a mantle or a coat or something. And for a minute, it almost seems like it's yours. And as you're inhabiting it, it can change the way you write. It can teach you skills you didn't have or didn't know you had. So I think I learned a great deal about tone and a certain kind of didacticism, for instance, from translating Horace.
And did you look at any other translations when you were doing that?
I did. It's amazing how different they are, you know, because I was fairly faithful to Horace. It wasn't like I was going way rogue with my translations. But different poets have different voices that they bring and different sorts of music. And once you change the tune and once you change the tone, the poem is very different.
Yeah, I can see that. I'd really like to have you read a couple of poems in a bit, if that's all right, but I just wanted to just briefly touch on the idea of the poet's mistake.
Yeah.
Because I think if something for me that runs through all your work is that you say that you're quite conventional, But I think there's a kind of subtle subversion in a lot of what you do. For example, the way that you play with rhymes. Was it maracas and carapace?
Oh, yes.
That's a good one.
Yes, or guacamole and rigmarole.
Exactly.
Very proud of that.
Brilliant. That's almost like Muldoon-like.
I probably shouldn't be proud of that one, although I do love Muldoonian rhymes, so it's a compliment.
It's fun. I mean, it's rhyme, but it's really fun rhyme. But I think The Poet's Mistake is a really brave book because in lots of ways it basically says, stop making excuses for poets who make mistakes.
Yes, I mean...
They just make mistakes. And you would talk even about Keats in that regard, like people who are really... People are frightened to even critique those kind of poets sometimes.
So, yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, in a certain way, it's a very old-fashioned sort of book. It has readings of single poems, and in that way, I wouldn't call it cutting-edge criticism. But in another way, I hope I am bold or subversive. I suppose I can say when I started that book, I thought I was creating a catalog of mistakes in poems, mistakes made by poets, and talking about them. And I thought, okay, well, this will be a funny book. This will be a book in which I can do close readings of single poems and tell stories, almost sort of tell biographies of single poems. That was the one thing I thought I was doing. What I feel like I ended up doing also was I made an argument about the kinds of criticism that readers of poems have been producing over the last, say, 100 years. And one of the most fun parts of writing the book was actually debunking some of the works of other critics when I felt that they were misreading or being overly generous to poets who make real mistakes. So I ended up making an argument not so much about poems overall, but an argument about how as critics we need to be willing to call a mistake when we see it, rather than writing incredibly creative excuses for why the poet could never be wrong, which is what ends up happening in poetry criticism.
And it's kind of weirdly cultish. It's almost like it's the self-sacrifice for your own criticism sometimes.
I know. Well, and we call it poetic license, right? That's a phrase that people use outside of the realm of poetry. Yeah. But actually, I don't think poets should have that much license. No. And in fact, poets themselves don't have that much license usually. Poets tend to create constraints for themselves rather than giving themselves license. I mean, imagine the sorts of poems that would be produced if poets had total free reign. It would be awful. This is why form exists. So, anyway.
Do you think you could give the listeners an example of like your favorite mistake?
The first mistake I talk about in the book is a mistake by Keats in which he confuses Cortez and Balboa. So he talks about Cortez discovering the Pacific Ocean, but of course we know it was Balboa. And what's interesting about this mistake for me is the history of close readings of this poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer, Keats's poem. Critics, really wonderful readers of Keats, have written the most extraordinary close readings explaining why he really did mean Cortez and not Balboa, when in fact Keats wrote this poem on his way home from his friend's house between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., so in the middle of the night. He composed it in his head, got home, wrote it down, and then sent it by courier back to his friend that morning. So we know he wrote it within a sort of 14-hour period that included the middle of the night.
And he would have been quite young, right?
He was very young, and he didn't have, his history book in front of him. And it wasn't like you could Google, which was it? Which Spanish conquistador was it who actually discovered the Pacific Ocean? It makes perfect sense that he got them confused. It was, in fact, Cortez who saw the Pacific, but just a few years after Balboa saw it. And but you wouldn't believe how critics have contorted the poem to say that it's about second sightings or belated discoveries, when it's not about that at all. I've actually gotten in trouble for that chapter in the book, though. The critics who who believe that he did truly mean Cortez, they came out in spades, with their spades, to attack me for having said so.
And do you think it's also partly because your book, and I mean this as a compliment, is so readable that it kind of transgresses that academic world as well? Your book is the only academic book I've ever read the word snafu in it, for
Well,
example.
yes.
But it is really readable. It's really engaging.
Thank
it doesn't
you.
feel like dry criticism. And I suppose that's another way in which it's quietly subversive, right? Because lots of people can read it. Not just the academy.
I didn't mean for it to be that way. But yeah, maybe so. I do hope it's readable. I don't want my criticism to be limited to the few academic readers that we have left. I wanted it to be possible for someone who likes poems, who cares about literary things generally, to be able to pick it up and also maybe to have a laugh.
And I think there's something really freeing about that, because it's, I'm always trying to say to students, particularly when I teach things like modernism, that, okay, T.S. Eliot is a huge, famous, imposing poet, but that doesn't mean that you can't take him to task on things.
Yeah.
And it's a lesson that students have to kind of learn in order to be critics.
What you're saying reminds me also of something I do when I teach, which is I want to allow my students to be a little bit evaluative when they're reading. It's not that I want students to come in without having thought about what they've read and say, I don't like this. I mean evaluative in a more nuanced way, that great students should feel free to try,
Why do you think those critics got so annoyed?
Well, I don't know if they may have simply been defending themselves or their friends, but I actually think we still have some sense of the mystical when we think about poetry. I know this podcast is called Demystifying Poetry, right? And, you wouldn't want to demystify it too far, because there is something truly enigmatic and magical about the best poems. The best poems, you read them and you think, I have no idea why I moved, But it isn't the case that you can't break poems down, understand things about them. It isn't the case that they weren't crafted, that they weren't full of decisions. And I just think over time, critics of poetry have tended to train themselves on the idea that with real poets, they really can't go wrong.
Yeah.
But what I think that kind of idea misses is that real poets take an awful lot of time trying to get things right, training themselves to have skills. And that involves getting things wrong, writing bad poems, not knowing the facts, mistaking grammar, misspelling, getting the meanings of words wrong. So the book has lots of examples of that kind. But I think it isn't really intuitive at the moment for most readers of poetry. It's not how we were taught to read poems.
And I wonder whether, because you, as you've stated already, you've always been a poet, maybe you're just more aware of that than other people as well. Maybe you feel like you're able to comment on that more because you're a critic and a poet.
Maybe. I wouldn't want to say that I that I know more about poetry than some of the critics, who even the ones who I take to task in the book. But it is true that for me, the writing of poetry always came first.
Yeah.
And so in my experience anyway, which is the only experience I can or should speak to, it's very easy to get things wrong in a poem. It's very easy to not know what you're talking about and still want to talk about it. So it seems only natural to me that the very best poets would have had, proper bloopers.
And they're fallible.
Yeah, and I love that about them.
Yeah. And I love that story about Keats, because what you could say is, even a poet a poem that he wrote when he was really young in the middle of the night is still a really great poem. It just doesn't mean that he'd got all the facts right.
That's right.
It's almost like two different arguments.
And it's tricky because Cortez definitely sounds better in the
Yeah.
poem than Balboa. I mean, Balboa has too many syllables, and it doesn't
yeah.
pick up the Z sound that is
Yeah.
important. But, you know, I think if Keats had known the facts,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have put Cortez in.
No, and I think sometimes word choice is to do with that kind of thing. I ended up writing quite a bit not long ago about potatoes because they pop up a lot in Irish poetry, but it's such an unharmonious word.
Oh, yeah.
It just doesn't really go with anything.
What rhymes with potato?
Well, nothing.
Tomato?
Yeah, well, in your accent.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Gosh.
But I got into this big thing where I was like, oh yeah, there are some words.
Yeah.
Like Balboa. That just aren't very poetic.
No, that's right.
And he's probably quite pleased. And yeah, as you say, he probably wouldn't have written a poem with that word in it because it's not a very poetic word.
Yeah, or he would have changed the metaphor, I think. But I'm glad he didn't because I wouldn't have had a whole chapter to write. And imagine how many articles would not have existed in this world. So.
And I know people will be listening now going, gosh, these people, they can talk about one word for ages. Isn't what they're doing really indulgent? But it's also fun, right?
Well, it is if the word is really good.
Yeah. So on to your poems. I think there's overlaps there for me between your poetry and your criticism, as I said earlier, because it is kind of deceptively simple. You were saying you're quite conventional with form, but I actually don't think you are that conventional with form. You have patterns and you have rhymes, but you also have this very, I think, clear interest in thingness, for want of a better word, which in itself is quite bold when so much of poetry these days is about abstraction and concepts and like leaving the page. Yours is definitely a poetry of the page, I think.
It is. Well, I want the poems to be like visual artifacts, as in I do want them to seem and look and feel on the page like poems. But it's true that I also do tend to like to write about things rather than ideas. There are some thinky conceptual poems in this book, but most of the poems are about things like birds or plants or balls, animals, a lot of animals in the book. Things are good because they allow you to talk about other things, but in the guise of another thing.
And you often use your things as a springboard, don't you, for kind of contemplation of relationships or
that's right.
family or
in a way, it's a book of anecdotes about events around things or the way things behave in this world, and I'm glad you think it's not too traditional or that there's something deceptive in its simplicity. I definitely admire that in other people's poetry.
I mean, I know a lot about Marianne Moore, and it does remind me of that, although you haven't got the sort of coldness that she has.
Yeah, well,
but, she's very particular about things, isn't she? And she's got hidden rhymes and quite a lot of play in her poetry, and often that's not as discussed as the more serious elements.
Right? Yeah, that's right. And she also uses animals
to
great effect. Yeah, I think animals and just things in general give you the chance to say something direct and accessible without being blunt or offensive.
So would you mind sharing a couple of poems with us?
Yeah, I'd love that. I guess I should probably read the first poem in the book because it introduces the title of the book. So the book is called Small Pointed Things, and the first poem has that phrase in it. So in a way, I've taken the title from the first poem. And it's a poem about small pointed things very, very directly. The book itself is a book of poems that I also think are like small pointed things. But anyway, I'll read the first poem, and then I might also read the last poem because in a way I think they're two companion poems.
Great, thank you.
Bats and swallows. Whatever the difference might be to one who knows, We couldn't see from where we stood in soft shadows any signs that they were swallows or bats. That there were wings was without doubt. You could see small pointed things swooping out into the gloaming, and sometimes back. One seemed almost iridescent as I tried to track its crescent flight across the hill. The lack of sound suggested bats to me. You strained to see if they nested somewhere below the terrace, having rested your case on swallows. We couldn't be sure either way, and so it follows that neither of us knows. But since it is in your nature always to side one way or the other, you hold that they were swallows. I say the question never gets old, that either or both hold sway.
I really like that it sounds like it's going to finish on hold, and it doesn't. Because you've got old and hold, and then you have a little word.
That was smart.
At the end. Very smart, yeah. Because it would mean something quite different if it was hold.
It would. Well, and
hold sway.
The issue is I would have then have rhymed hold with hold instead of hold with old.
And I think sway makes you think more like birds again, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It's really good. I love it. And you read it so well.
Thanks.
Well, I love that idea of that scientific decisiveness versus artsy. Well,
that's right.
It might be this, it might not be that. Does it matter?
It's the difference between me and my husband.
Yeah.
And he didn't want me to publish this poem, which is why I put it first in the book. Because he seemed so insistent, even after I wrote it, that it was definitely swallows. And maybe it was, but I mean, we cannot be sure. And for me, that is the joy. And, you know, one of the things that poetry offers, right, is the possibility of being ambivalent about something or not knowing.
But also being comfortable with that, I think. Like sitting with that lack of knowledge.
Being in uncertainties, doubts. That's what Keats said negative capability was. And the poet should have it. But, you know, I write a lot of poems to my husband or in conversation with him throughout the book. And in a way, it's partly a book about two very distinct things having to coexist. And not all of the poems are obviously about me and my husband. One poem is about pumpkins and swans and how those two things are things that just should not go together, couldn't possibly go together. And yet, if you have a pumpkin patch and a swan lands in it, you know, suddenly they go together. So that's kind of the way the book proceeds, with other things too, like poems.
And that's fascinating
about my kids
as well, because I can think of countless poems with swans in them, but not very many with pumpkins in them.
That's right. That's right. Maybe I should read that poem.
Yeah, sure.
I'll read that poem, and then I'll read the final poem, which is the companion piece to Bats and Swallows. Okay. Pumpkins and Swans. Remember Eddie's story about swans landing in his pumpkin fields? So much white, unexpected glory scurrying over a season's leftover yields. They surely had their reasons for wanting those bright orbs, weighed the pros and cons of stopping mid-flight. But the image of their ghostly plumage haunting such large orange balls still appalls. Something wasn't right.
I just love your rhymes. They always make me titter.
Oh, thanks. That's one of the poems in the books that has rhymes kind of far away from each other. So a lot of the poems in here...
There's a bit of a weight for the
a lot of the poems here are in stanzas, and it's sort of clear when the rhyme is going to happen. But there are some poems that move down the page in a block, and sometimes the companion rhyme is 7, 8, 9, 10 lines from the other one. So you're kind of waiting for it.
And I love the idea of the swans having kind of agency as well. That's really nice.
Well, I think they do. I mean, this is a true story. Eddie is a pumpkin farmer out in Washington State, and I spoke to him on the phone, and he told me this story. He thought it was a beautiful confluence, though. When he said it, I was thinking, oh no, swans, majestic swans,
And
and
pumpkins.
big orange balls. But
And when you go to pumpkin patches as well, often they're quite muddy places. They're not as glamorous as you would think. They rot and...
yeah, no, that is so true. And also, pumpkins are often misshapen.
Yes.
That's what makes
and
pumpkins
miscoloured and all
beautiful.
Yeah.
Whereas swans are perfect.
They are perfect, yeah.
Yeah.
I
so-
think that's why they end up in so much art.
Yeah.
Visual and
They're
verbal.
living sculptures.
Yeah.
And a lot of good poems about swans. I mean, some of the
Lots
best
and lots.
poems ever written about
Yeah, exactly.
swans. I don't think, I'm afraid, my Pumpkins and Swans is going to be held on Mount Parnassus as one of the great swan
Well,
poems.
in Critics and Connoisseurs, Marianne Moore talks about swans on the lake in Oxford.
That's right.
And they're black swans. And I wrote something about how that was a mistake because it was impossible.
Because black swans are only in the southern hemisphere?
Correct.
Yeah. Why didn't you tell me that before I published my book?
I think I'd forgotten about
could
it
have had a
until about
whole
5
chapter.
minutes ago.
I love that poem too.
Yeah.
I could write a whole chapter on it.
And she had been to Oxford and she had seen swans.
Wow.
And in her diary, she just says she's seen swans. And so she sort of overlays, I guess. It looked like she'd been reading about black swans. And she sort of overlays that into her story about Oxford. But it's a snafu.
Well, this is going to have to be for, series 2, the Poet's Mistake series 2.
I only just remembered that because I wrote about it quite a long time ago. It got out of my head.
But James Merrill's poem, The Black Swan, is the great Black Swan poem. Whereas I guess Yeats's 2 swan poems.
Yes, Later in the Swan and The Wild Swans Are Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Those are
fantastic
good.
poems.
Okay.
A bit darker than yours.
I think so. Well, I'll read my second bird poem here. It's
Okay,
not a
great.
swan poem, but as I said, it's a companion piece to Bats and Swallows. And Bats and Swallows is the first poem in the book, and this is the last poem in the book, and it's also a poem that represents a conversation between me and my husband, and a poem about birds. And I hope there's some development of this relationship, some working through of what seemed in that first poem like an impossible incompatibility. Blackbirds. She is brown, I said to you, less in annoyance than wonder when she flew past us with a certain flamboyance, not over but under our gate to settle down into the tree beside her mate. But he is black, you replied, and the name is his. As it always is, I poked. I was your bride and took your name, yet we are not the same. You'd have joked back, but couldn't deny it. We grew quiet when we heard the blackbirds sharing words between them. Whose song it was we would never know, not having seen them sing. But it would be wrong to say, even if we could.
It's so lovely. I love that kind of metaphor for kind of marital ownership.
That's right. Sometimes you just have to agree never to agree. Or that maybe the agreement is somehow beyond you. It's an agreement that doesn't happen on the surface.
And I also think, because I heard you read that before, and I remember thinking that one of those things, like I didn't take my husband's name, but it's very easy to do it without really thinking about it until after. And then you're like,
I know.
And I know lots of women I know who would definitely call themselves feminists who just did that without really thinking twice. And then a few years later, they're like, oh, that's a strange thing that I did.
Yeah. I took my husband's name and did think hard about it. And it was mainly because I liked the name better. McAlpine. It doesn't really do much with my Jewish heritage.
What is your maiden name? I don't think I know it.
My maiden name is Levy. So, and I think I look like an Erica Levy, whereas I don't look like an Erica McAlpine. But that's something I like too. I like being preceded by my name and then showing up as a surprise. They think Erica McAlpine is coming, but then Erica Levy walks into the room.
So they see like a Ginger Scott.
That's right. But one of the funny things about taking his name is actually I published a poem, the first poem I ever published in my whole life, a few months before we got married. And I had to decide at that point whether I was going to publish it under my maiden name or what was going to be my new married name. And I thought, well, gosh, this is the only publication I have, the very first publication of my life of any kind. If I just start with my married name, there'll be no confusion ever. Everything will be under the same name. And I told my friend Dorothy this, and she said, you can't publish your poem under a name you don't yet have. And I was like, well, why not? And she said, well, I'd be afraid that I would publish under my new married name before I got married, and then I'd get hit by the bus and I'd never get married. Which I thought was so dark.
Well, if you're dead, you wouldn't know either.
I know. Well, that's what I thought. And I went ahead and published under Erica McAlpine, even though it was 2 months before I was...
I think it's quite a nice romantic statement of hope, you know?
Thank you. Yeah.
You're like, I know I'm going to be this person and I'm still going to have my identity.
Yeah. And I knew he wasn't going to abandon me at the altar. So
just as we're winding down, just wondered whether you read poetry for yourself in your own time, like we were talking about this today. That
of course I do.
Well, we were saying, Rid and I were saying, we have trouble finding the time, to be honest, when we're also teaching poetry. Yeah. Sometimes it's quite hard.
But this is why I teach poetry and not prose. You can read a poem very quickly, whereas...
You must teach prose sometime.
I do. I have to. Well, the way the teaching works here at Oxford, you will sort of have to teach by period rather than by genre. So I do teach the novel, but not that much. I read poetry for fun and I read it for work. But I don't read maybe as much contemporary poetry as you might think as a person who writes poetry in a contemporary life. I really like traditional forms and old stuff, and I don't know. I return to poets like Browning and Dickinson and Marianne Moore and Frost and
Elizabeth Bishop as well.
Bishop is a favorite, and or even older poets like Sidney.
Oh, Sidney's great.
I love him.
Astrophil and Stella is wonderful.
Those sonnets just get me every time. They're so clever. They're so funny. They're so feeling. Or Petrarch. I love Petrarch too. And actually, there's a Petrarch translation in Small Pointed Things. I really love a good sonnet sequence of unrequited love.
Me too.
You know, that's the kind of stuff you can read on a Saturday night and really get yourself worked up.
I wish I could read a sonnet sequence on a Saturday night.
Well,
I'd probably just fall asleep in bed with the paper or something.
But you only have to read one or two, 28 lines at the most.
Okay, you're inspiring me. I'll try.
Yeah.
I wrote a whole book on sonnets and I don't think I've ever sat in bed reading sonnets.
Well,
I've read them obviously, but not in that kind of context.
Yeah. That's the thing about work, isn't it? You tend to separate what you read for fun and what you don't. And maybe this is why I like to read, really old poetry for fun. Is that I
don't necessarily teach it.
Yeah, I teach contemporary poetry, for instance, and a lot of 20th century poetry. So it feels like a kind of indulgence to be reading something that was written 500 years ago.
So if you were speaking to a student who was really frightened of poetry, really nervous, what would you tell them to read?
It's not that I would tell them something specific or some specific poet. What I would tell them, I would be more prescriptive, Tara.
Well, that's true.
I would tell them how to read. I would tell them that they have to stop thinking that the poem is a puzzle that they have to unpack or solve. I think when people say, oh, I'm not very good at reading poetry, or I find poetry really difficult, it's because they're imagining that they're in some kind of adversarial relationship with the poet who's trying to trick them. And actually, the poet is usually just trying to be loved. Think about the poets.
So nice.
Poets are very needy, emotionally needy.
Yeah.
They just want readers to love them. And you could love a poem in any way. You don't have to get it.
Well, it also makes me think about I.A. Richards. He's got that essay called communication and the artist, hasn't he? Where he's like, a good poem is a poem that communicates.
Yeah, but
So if it doesn't communicate, then it's not actually doing its job.
That's right. But you have to remember that even a difficult poem, a poem we might consider inaccessible in some way, is still communicating and could communicate to a very novice reader. You know, it would be okay to read a poem and to say simply, oh, I love that word, or...
Well, we were talking to a concrete poet about this very issue, and in lots of ways, she comes from the opposite part of the world to you. You know, she was saying at one side you have thingness, and at the other side you have everything is form. But she was saying to us that kids find that so much easier than adults do. Yeah. You know, she's like, this balloon is a poem, and this balloon is a poem, and this wall is a poem, and they go, yeah, fine.
Right. Whereas adults would say, well, but what does that mean? Yeah. Or I don't get it.
Yeah.
Or
I must be stupid because I don't get it.
Right. And I think that is the problem for people who think they're not poetry people, is they've somehow gotten themselves worked up into thinking they're inadequate. When that's never the case. There's always something you could get from a poem.
Yeah. So for you, it's not really the choice of poem, but more you're trying to work on your attitude towards how you read it and encounter it.
I learned this the hard way, actually. It was Wallace Stevens who taught me.
Gosh, okay.
Wallace,
very difficult.
He is very difficult, and yet he wrote this poem called The Plain Sense of Things.
That's true.
And when I first read that poem, I thought it was so hard. I couldn't understand a thing about it. I thought it seemed to be presenting some kind of philosophy. Turns out, after years of studying it, it's actually just about sense.
Yeah.
Like your senses.
The sense of things.
Yeah. That you could read that poem and think, oh, it's pretty, or it doesn't make sense, or it's too plain, or you could think anything about it.
Well, it's a bit like his poem, The Snowman.
Yeah, that's a hard one, too.
Well, it is quite hard, but then you sort of realise that what he's doing is just breaking down the word snowman into snow and man. And thinking about all the different ways of thinking about snow and man.
I hadn't even realised that, Tara. To me, I'm still stuck on the line, is it junipers shagged with ice?
Yeah.
That's just so pretty.
I'm just tired.
I love that. There are a lot of ways to read a hard poem, is the point.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, I used to do more lecturing than I do now, and I used to find the Wallace Stevens lecture the hardest one that I gave. But then it is an interesting challenge to be like, well, maybe this poem is about snow, you know, and this poem is about things.
Yeah, or this poem isn't about, this poem just is like, or this poem just sounds.
And he's got some quite clear ones, like the one that's called The Irish Cliffs of Moher, which is about the Irish Cliffs of Moher that he saw on a postcard.
Yeah.
And what he got from that, you know.
Right.
It kind of plays with Wordsworth and the sublime, but really it's about the Irish Cliffs of Moher.
Yeah, sometimes poems do what they say they do, or they mean what they say, and sometimes they don't.
That sounds like a really good place to end. Thank you so much. It's been such a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it.
It's great chatting with you,
Thank you
Tara.
for sharing your lovely poems as well.
You're very welcome.
See you next time on Demystifying Poetry. If you've enjoyed the podcast, do consider sharing it with your friends and your neighbours and anyone else you know. And also, you might consider sharing it on social media channels. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can comment on YouTube or Spotify.